Right. Welcome everybody. This is a 30-minute slot now that takes us through to lunch at 1 o'clock. John here is going to be filling his entire slot with his talk. In fact, he's a little nervous that getting it down to that length of time could be a feat in its own right. So if you have any questions, then you'll need to keep them till afterwards and find John over lunch. So, John, over to you.
Thank you very much. There are a lot more people than I was expecting. I'm wondering if this is down to the PHP talk in the other room, which I actually wanted to go to, so that's a bit embarrassing. So I want to talk to you about neurodiversity in tech. This kind of started off as a lightning talk last year that I didn't get a chance to do. It's been milling around in my brain for ages, and then about 2 hours before the talk deadline, someone, Zeph, goes, "You should totally do that talk." And then I ended up signing up, and they accepted it, and now I'm stuck with it. If you remember only one thing, humans have different operating systems. I can't remember where I got that phrase from, but I think that pretty much sums it up. Everything else in this talk is basically fluff from this point onwards, so just remember that bit. My main thing is just to get people to embrace differences. I want people to embrace those differences. I want people to see the strengths and not just the sort of the weaknesses that people see, or rather society imposes on people. But the important thing is there are challenges with a lot of these things as well. As I've just said, it's a difficult talk to do. I'm used to talking about technology, not about people, and in particular, a lot of the people I'm going to be talking about are not me. They're people I know, and so as a result, I'm not comfortable taking questions. I am definitely not an expert. I was going to have a picture of Michael Gove, because he was very famous about saying that no one trusts experts anymore. And I am an outsider, although that's a little bit of a lie. There's something later on where I actually do have personal experiences with that. As well as technology, I teach adaptive snow sports, which is disability snow sports. I've been working regularly with autistic snowboarders and skiers. My nephew was diagnosed last year as on the Autism Spectrum, which caused a bit of a panic amongst my family, like, oh my God, what do we do? And of course, because I've had experience of dealing with people who are autistic, I was like, relax, it'll be fine. He's going to need to adjust, society's going to need to adjust different ways of handling it. I'm a proud uncle, so basically this talk is to try and produce a foundation of getting people to embrace these different conditions, and so that when he's a lot older, people will understand the way he perceives the world. And that kind of links into this whole thing of neurodiversity. There's a woman called Judy Singer. Her family, as far back as she could remember, like her mother and her grandmother, had issues dealing with social communication, and they found it very difficult to sort of interact with people. And then eventually she had a daughter. Her daughter was diagnosed with Asperger's, and when she started to investigate what Asperger's was, she realised that she had the symptoms herself, and also her family history also had Asperger's. And suddenly things started to make sense. She started to interact online to find other people with the condition, and there was a big debate about ways of sort of discussing these issues. And she came up with the term of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is facing the same kind of issues that physical disabilities have already faced. There's a big push at the moment about mental illness, which has always been a bit of a taboo subject, not just in tech, but in society in general. Related to that is the whole issue of neurodiversity. More and more people are having to face, like, a society doesn't really understand that different people have different ways of wiring their brain. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the autism spectrum and ADHD as well. ADHD was something I kind of put in near the last minute of this talk. First off, who has heard of autism? I would hope pretty much everyone has. Asperger. Asperger is facing an interesting situation at the moment in the fact that some diagnostic manuals are trying to merge Asperger and autism together, which has caused a bit of reaction in the Asperger community, because a lot of people who identify in the Asperger syndrome are very proud of being what's called an Aspie, In fact, when I talked about this last year, about doing the lightning talk, I put the slides up, and I instantly got a load of tweets from people going, hey, I'm an Aspie, this is great, you should totally do this talk. And I was quite surprised by that. I wasn't expecting a lot of people to say about it. Pathological demand avoidance. Anyone heard of that? 3 people. It's a very new part of the autism spectrum. I hadn't really heard of it until I had a lesson with someone on a snowboard lesson who turned up, and they basically had this condition, and I knew nothing about it. And I still really don't know too much about it, so I won't cover it. And then ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Most people associate it with children. I bet a lot of people didn't realise that adults also have this condition. About 2/3 of children end up taking that condition into adulthood. I won't be covering a whole lot of things like bipolar disorder. I actually have been diagnosed with anxiety disorder in the past. I had to have treatment for that, so that's kind of where I wasn't really an imposter. Hans Asperger, he was the man, along with Kenner, I think it was Keller, who was investigating children that were written off as being feeble-minded or suffering from childhood schizophrenia. And this is back in 1938. He made a speech in 1938, and bearing in mind he was an Austrian scientist who was working in Nazi Germany. He made the very bold decision when they were talking about eugenics, about actually trying to point out that these children weren't genetically inferior, and in fact they could be the secret to the future of the human race, which was a very bold thing, bearing in mind he could have faced execution for what he was saying. So there's a bit of a debate about how many children he actually saved as a result of that. As I said earlier on about it's sort of identifying the differences from what's called the norm. The norm is often regarded by people as like positive, and anything that doesn't quite lie outside that is considered negative, which, as we know, is not necessarily correct. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. Autism Spectrum Quotient. Has anyone heard of the AQ test? A few hands. First off, I'll go into this little quote. This is from Jim Sinclair, who's a neurodiversity advocate. He is Autism Spectrum, I believe. Well, yeah, he would be Autism Spectrum. He's autistic. And he made this very good point here, which is that autism is actually just part of the human person, right? There's no way of treating it or separating it and so on. And the autism spectrum is generally boiled down to these 3 points. The third bit was kind of added a little bit more recently. But social interaction or communication difficulties, repetitive behaviour or narrow interests. Someone actually refers to this as the geek syndrome, which I'll get to shortly. Sensory over and under sensitivity is also an interesting issue that doesn't tend to get mentioned in the diagnostic manuals. A lot of people that I know who are autistic have issues with busy scenes, lots of people around, lots of noise, so they might have to wear ear protectors to try and block out that. If you're very sensitive to a lot of things, you can put a lot of stress, like my nephew can occasionally go into a meltdown when it comes to doing things as we take as simple as putting on a pair of new shoes. It's quite a traumatic experience. The ATQ test is basically a diagnostic test of 50 questions. About 80% of people who score on the spectrum will score 30 or more. That also means that 20% don't lie in that pattern. And also there are a lot of people who would score very highly on the test who are definitely not in the autistic spectrum. So it's not a perfect tool. There was a survey done by Channel 4 and one of the universities, which I can't remember and I forgot to attribute the slides. They studied 400,000 people in the UK and asked them to do the AQ test online. And that was the skew. Now remember that 30 line, 80% of people on the autism spectrum will be on that part. And you know, it's a reasonable standard distribution, slightly skewed lower on. But when we get to STEM and non-STEM careers, I'm not sure what other was. I don't really know, because surely that's binary. It's either STEM or not STEM. So anyway, again, I forgot to attribute the slide. There was an A. The A is not very exciting. So you can see that non-STEM careers shifted more away from the magic 30 point, and STEM careers are shifted more towards that 30 point. I think the difference is an average of about 3 or 4 points. I test 21, which puts me about in the just slightly average of the STEM career. The problem with that test is it kind of implies a linear spectrum. You hear terms like high versus low functioning, mild versus extreme. My nephew's diagnostic is mild. But the problem with that is it kind of perpetuates this stereotype of, hey, as you go further down the autism spectrum, you become more and more incapable of interacting with society, which is nonsense. Lorna Wing, that came up with the term autism spectrum, actually came up with something more along this lines. I love this cartoon. If you get a chance, look at the actual original. There's a whole load of stuff, not just that one. But this is the best bit, because it shows that, in fact, actually, rather than being a single line, you effectively have different sets of skills. And someone on the autism spectrum will have different degrees. For example, my nephew, he escaped detection. He escaped diagnostic originally because he's very sociable and outgoing. So a lot of doctors didn't believe that he was autistic for the simple fact that he was able to communicate and express himself and talk to people, although he did have language delays. So. Flow and focus, I'm going to jump around a little bit again. Flow is defined as being a complete absorption in what we do. So a lot of training manuals, there's a lot of courses, there's a lot of relaxation tapes, all aimed at getting people into a flow to be able to do tasks to maximum productivity. So I'm going to jump around. ADHD. ADHD is defined as being inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. The inattention is a particular issue. A lot of people, because it says attention deficit, people think that anyone with ADHD is incapable of actually keeping a focus on anything for a period of time. This is actually not true. Hyperfocus is defined in a very similar way. It's that complete absorption in a task. And for some strange reason, some people sort of see one as being positive and one as being negative. And in fact, ADHD is famous for the hyperfocus ability. If you have something of interest, you can get very, very focused on that task. So I said flow is kind of seen as a positive thing. Hyperfocus is seen as a negative. You actually read the Wikipedia articles, they do later on say, well, focus could be really bad if it's very narrow and focused and you're losing attention to all kinds of stuff. And likewise, hyperfocus is generally seen by society as a negative thing, but in actual fact, it's just flow. It's getting in that mental state. Some people are more positively capable of getting into that state with the right things. Adults with ADHD score above average for sustained work on urgent tasks compared to the general population. Ed Finkler, has anyone heard of Ed Finkler? He's responsible for the open sourcing mental illness, which I have a sticker for. He has adult ADHD. He was diagnosed about 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And he's very big on the fact that he believes that allowed him to have a very successful career as a developer, because until he was diagnosed, he couldn't understand why he was capable of doing these sustained focus on very urgent tasks. ADHD is also linked to increased learning and flexibility of thought. What happens with ADHD is there's a sort of late developer process involved with it. And in fact, this late development actually allows people to sustain that childlike interest and learning through into later stages when normally our brains are starting to adapt to being less susceptible to learning. So in actual fact, it's linked to a lot of creativity, a lot of childlike play, a lot of flexibility in learning, which a lot of people, as they go into adult, starts to lose. Now, socialization and communication is an interesting one. I said that before. Temple Grandin, who's heard of Temple Grandin? She's arguably one of the most famous autistic people in the world. She does design for farm and agriculture, and she's famous for spotting problems with architectural buildings that were about to collapse and no one figured it out and stuff. She's written some very good books on the subject. I love that quote. Some guy with Asperger's developed the first stone sphere. It wasn't developed by the social ones yakking around the campfire. I love that quote. So, as I said, autism spectrum, social interaction or communication difficulties. With autism, you generally get a language delay, which is one of the things that tip people off to my nephew. Whereas with Asperger's good language skills, Hans Asperger actually mentioned what he called his little professors. These were kids that were capable of learning languages at a very early age to a very, very precise, very high degree, as well as having all kinds of other interests. Now, I was quite surprised, but actually the history of communication has kind of had this hidden history with autism. The first social network arguably was all the amateur radio, and it was discovered that a lot of people who until more recently would have been diagnosed with Asperger's or autism were using amateur radio to sort of bypass society's issues with their communication. So, for example, non-verbal people were using Morse code, not just over radio, but actually to communicate to each other in meetings and so on, tapping out messages to each other. But yeah, it provided them with a way to communicate not just with their own immediate family or friends, but actually with a wider society. Likewise, voice. If you have problems interpreting people's body language, if you have problems, standing up in front of a group of people and talking, but you have a voice, you can use radio to be able to communicate to other people. So it allowed social interaction. The other thing is also there was a whole, hobbyist electronic stuff, which allowed people who maybe find problems with other people difficult, but with machinery, there's a much easier ability to understand the rules, understand the structure, and be able to funnel that creativity into that technical side of things. Lee Felsenstein. Who's heard of Lee Felsenstein? No one. I hadn't heard of him either until this, and I've got to read up more about this guy. He's apparently the major influence on the technical and social environment of the early personal computing era. He struggled with human relationships. Girlfriends of his would complain that he was always distant, didn't really sort of understand how to manage a relationship with people, and he kind of ended up funneling his interests into computers. He discovered computers back in the 60s and started programming and realized that he could actually sort of understand the interaction with computers better than with humans. But in actual fact, he still had these thoughts about communication, how to interact with society. So in 1973, he was one of the first developers of the very first electronic bulletin board system, which was to put public terminals in public places that would then connect to a mainframe computer at the university and allow people to send and receive messages to each other, no matter whereabouts they were. And that was quite an interesting thing at the time because no one really had thought about that. So he was kind of hacking the stuff around him to allow him to communicate and express himself. He was also one of the early members of the Homebrew Computer Club, which was famous for kickstarting the whole 8-bit micro revolution. And also he was one of the designers for the Osborne 1, which is the first portable computer. Effectively, his whole thing has been about trying to make computers accessible to all kinds of people, make them as cheap and portable and efficient as possible. And in the 1990s, he was finally diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And all of a sudden, he actually understood why he was having these issues and why he was trying to sort of push his skills. The internet era also provided the first chance for a lot of people to interact and led to the whole neurodiverse culture. As I said about Judy Singer, she eventually found a mailing list for, I think it was a group in the Netherlands. And through those, it's called INLV actually. And through that, she and others started to talk about the advocacy. So rather than being treated as, oh, you've got this condition, there's something wrong with you, let's push you to the sides of society, they were looking at groups like the gay rights movement and feminism and so on and going, well, we should totally do this as well. There's no way we're going to change ourselves. It's part of who we are. We should advocate our outlook to the rest of society. Let society work out who we are, really. It also provided people with niche interests to find an outlet. One of the things about the autism spectrum is some people have very narrow interests. And some of those interests are so refined and so precise, it's very difficult to find other people in your immediate vicinity who are able to understand what you're talking about. So it allowed people to find other people around the world who actually shared the same interests as them. And it also provided an outlet for creativity. I mean, as programmers, we all know how much fun it is to actually write software and solve people's problems. And likewise, it gives people the ability to do a lot of stuff that maybe the time and the resources are not necessarily available. 5 minutes, yick. So Pokémon Go, very popular, allows a lot of people to go out and explore and interact with people, and it follows rules and it's structured and so on like that. I'm going to have to speed up now, aren't I? Is it really 5 minutes? Right. Pattern recognition, AQ test question. Right, systems thinking is stronger in autistic individuals. They tend to be better at understanding how things relate to each other and fit together. I tend to notice details that others do not. That specificity overrides generality. The great phrase I saw was "can't see the forest for the trees." It's very difficult to see that forest when everything is focused on all those individual ones. Your mind is a room where 20 radios all blaring, all tuned to different stations and blaring out voices and music. Go read that book, The Reason I Jump. It's a Japanese boy who learned to communicate using a finger spelling board, and his mother asks him questions in the book. Why do you do this? Why do you do that? There's a big campaign at the moment in the National Autistic Society about too much information, which is that slide. There's a big sort of thing, a misunderstanding about when people have meltdowns, because effectively the entire thing is just constantly bombarding you. I'm really speeding up now, aren't I? Strong local analysis and enhanced perception leads to good debugging skills. Who here does a lot of QA? Not many, actually. There's a few people now admitting it. Yeah, your jobs are in danger. Companies are employing autistic people for their analytic and debugging skills. Now, bearing in mind, in the UK, out of 700,000 people estimated to have autism, currently only 17% are in full-time employment. That's horrifying when you think about it. I found a great company, I think they're in America, called Aspiratech. They, I believe, are owned and run entirely by people on the autism spectrum, and they are using people on the autism spectrum to perform all their QA. They outsource their QA to, other companies outsource their QA to them. For these very reasons, detail, precision, repetitive tasks is something I haven't really mentioned a lot. It's proving very successful. SAP, I think that's how you pronounce it, their goal is to actually have 1% of their workforce, which actually is about the percentage of people on the spectrum, anyway, in the general population. They want to have 1% of people at SAP on the autism spectrum. They actually had to change their interview process. For some people, the interview process, I mean, I'm not autistic and I find them stressful. It was so bad that people just wouldn't turn up to interview, or they'd have a meltdown in the interview. So they actually changed it such that rather than bombarding people with questions, all they need to do is give them a nice quiet room, give a load of Lego mindstorms and stuff like that, and just ask them to play and build. And they can observe the person working, so they understand how their problem-solving skills are and stuff like that. And it's a far less traumatic experience, and it allows people that otherwise would not work with the conventional interview system to actually join the company and be beneficial. And I think I've done it now. So effectively, as I said at the beginning, if you remember one thing, everyone has a different human operating system. So embrace and support those different operating systems. Great minds do not think alike. Thank you very much. Never rewrite your talk about 100 times.
Thank you very much, John, and congratulations on getting that down into the 25 minutes. That was a feat in its own right. There's a break for lunch now, and we look forward to seeing you all this afternoon.
Wow.